Hi, my name is Kelp, and this is The Lion of Poetry. I chose to welcome you for this episode from the outside, out in the cold, out in the snow, just so you know that this is coming from Canada, and that this is the dead of winter. You might have actually thought that I was dressing up as the Lion of Poetry. You might have mistaken the fur around my face for a mane. But really, the reason I want to emphasize cold and snow and ice today is because today we're focusing on Canada's sister country in this regard. Of course, I'm talking about Russia. And the name of today's poet is Anna Akhmatova. Anna Akhmatova was born in the year 1889 and died in the year 1966. These were tumultuous years in the history of Russia. She lived through 2 world wars and, of course, the Russian Revolution. She was born into a well-to-do family. Her childhood was idyllic and carefree, almost decadent. She was well-educated, she traveled, and she began to write poems at a very young age. Almost inevitably, the theme of her early poems was love. The rapture of a first love, the sadness and disruptive nature of a painful breakup. These early poems were clear, lucid, and emotionally charged without sinking into sentimentality. In fact, she was part of a poetic movement that became popular in Russia in the early 1900s called Acmeism. Acme like a peak, like the top, where the goal of this movement was to write poems that were clear and carefully crafted. It was actually a reaction to an earlier poetic movement called symbolism, which we may talk about in a future episode. Anyway, Anna became one of the leaders of the Acmeist movement. And as a young, successful poet in Russia in the early years of the 20th century, she was very much accepted by the Russian poetic community, which included poets like Boris Pasternak of Dr. Zhivago fame and Osip Mandelstam. And she had romantic relationships with many of them. Her first husband, Nikolai Gumilev, was also a poet and a fellow Acmeist. They traveled extensively throughout Europe, and as a young woman, Anna met many famous artists and writers in Europe and was also accepted as an equal among them. But then the Russian Revolution changed everything for her. With the rise to power of Joseph Stalin, many artists were either executed outright or sent to labor camps in the Gulag. And their creative work was condemned, banned, and censored. This was the case for many of Anna's close friends and colleagues, and she herself was targeted by the Stalinist government and suffered both in her person and in the official condemnation of her work. Anna was married 3 times in her life. Her first husband, Nikolai, was killed by the Soviet police, and her third husband died in a prison camp. She also had a son, Lev, who was a somewhat controversial character himself. He was a historian with a political bent, and he spent close to 20 years in a labor camp in the Gulag. Anna was persuaded to write a poem, a kind of propaganda poem in praise of Stalin, in order to perhaps get a release or at least a shorter sentence for her son, which she did write, but to no avail. Anna herself was offered opportunities to leave Russia, but true to her nature, she chose to stay in Russia to be both a witness and a participant in the sufferings of her generation. So what's interesting for me about Anna was her transformation. I'm not as interested in her early poems, which could be classified as lyric poems. Lyric poetry is usually very personal, presented in the first person, expresses personal emotions and feelings and relationships. What I'm more interested in is the poet that she became, a poet of her people and her time. So she moves from being a lyric poet to an epic poet. And by epic, I mean reflecting the times that she was living in and the culture of her time. Really a voice of her generation. Now, before I read you some selections from her work, I want to try to articulate to you why I think it's important, why it's so important to read her poetry. You know, I didn't study Anna Akhmatova in school, and you probably didn't either. My studies were predominantly limited to English-speaking poets and writers from England or North America. If we only study our own culture and have no exposure to other cultures, we're inevitably going to miss out. And maybe this is the reason why it's so difficult to achieve peace, love, and understanding in the world. Because we consistently miss out on these tremendous opportunities that we have to see the world from a different perspective. I never lived under a totalitarian regime, but I think it's important to understand the perspective of someone who has. Most of our problems in North America are literally first world problems, as we often say. And learning how to appreciate and understand the problems of the rest of the world will only help us to become more sensitive and more humane. Anna's most famous poem, which is a vivid exposure and a strong condemnation of Stalinism, is called Requiem. It's a long poem, but I would just like to read you a few short passages from the preface and from the epilogue. In other words, from the beginning and the end. First, I'll read the preface to Requiem, which I think is self-explanatory. The preface to Requiem. In the fearful years of the Yezhov terror, I spent 17 months in prison queues in Leningrad. One day somebody identified me. Beside me in the queue, there was a woman with blue lips. She had, of course, never heard of me, but she suddenly came out of that trance so common to us all and whispered in my ear. Everybody spoke in whispers there. "Can you describe this?" And I said, "Yes, I can." And then something like the shadow of a smile crossed what had once been her face. We see in this preface almost a beckoning from the common people for Anna to express and articulate for them the pain and the suffering that is going on for all of them, so that it can be recorded for all humanity and for posterity. And now from the same poem, Requiem, the first stanza from the epilogue. There I learned how faces fall apart, how fear looks out from under the eyelids, how deep are the hieroglyphics cut by suffering on people's cheeks. There I learned how silver can inherit the black, the ash blonde overnight, the smiles that faded from the poor in spirit, terror's dry coughing sound. And I pray not only for myself, but also for all those who stood there in bitter cold or in the July heat under that red, blind prison wall. I love the image of hieroglyphics cut by suffering. So powerful. Anna Akhmatova was twice shortlisted for the Nobel Prize for Literature, but she never won the Nobel Prize. And though she did outlive Stalin, she died in 1966, her legacy was probably never secure in her own mind. And indeed, probably many of her poems were completely lost due to censorship. However, she did influence a younger generation of Russian poets, most notably Joseph Brodsky, who did win the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1987 and credits Anna as one of his greatest influences. Well, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time on The Lion of Poetry.